And we're recording.
So
Cool.
yeah, I think that a good thing that a thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently about this whole Israel-Palestine thing, and it's what everybody's talking about. I think it's shaping up to be the issue of our time. And I think a lot of what I've been like taking in these last few days is just seeing the shift that's happened in the media coverage and just the response from like the normal person that's not very politically aware. And I think that, when initially when what happened in on October 7th in Israel, I think a lot of people that, let's just say they're not really politically aware, that they're just neutral about the whole situation when they saw what happened. I think a lot of just normal, regular people took the side of Israel because they were the clear victim in what had happened. And then I think in the subsequent time, because of social media and because of the world that we live in now, and it's completely understandable too. I don't want to like this is a thing that I think is be important to like just think about and talk about and think out loud about. In that subsequent time, I think we've seen a lot of images of dead children, of innocent women, coming out of the rubble, just the most horrific possible things you can, that's just the worst of the worst, seeing innocent children burned to death because of a bomb, and this is because of the Israeli airstrikes. And I think that a lot of people in that subsequent time have kind of stood back and been like, oh, well, now this has become a lot more complicated, in their eyes. I'm not saying it's correct, but I think for a lot of people now, seeing all these images that we've been seeing of dead children, and not seeing that vice versa in Israel, right? Because Israel has the Iron Dome. Israel has a way better capacity with protecting themselves, and they have way more firepower than Hamas does. Um, but yeah, I think that's just a a thing that's going on in a lot of people's heads right now. Is that initially okay, Israel, and now I think that that pendulum is starting to swing towards Palestine, towards Gaza. And I think in this conversation, me and you are going to try to, I don't want to say justify and I don't want to say rationalize, but I think we're going to try to as best explain the reality of war and the reality of certain situations and the reality of you don't want to, at the same time, these are euphemisms, right? Collateral damage. When you're just talking about dead civilians, you're talking about the worst, again, the worst possible things you can think of. But but a funny thing too that I've been thinking about is that we're gonna explain the reality of war, right? Because at the end of the day, this is what it is. But at the same time, it's ironic too in my brain, and I'm trying to as best objectively observe this situation because you could argue that what we're doing is trying to justify, right? Trying to rationalize away dead children, rationalize away innocent civilians dying. And ironically, this is exactly what the pro-Palestinian crowd does all the time. This is what the free Palestine people do. Every time you bring up innocent civilians being massacred, being murdered to death, people that had nothing to do with anything being burned alive, you always hear the yeah, but look at the historical context. Yeah, but look at the root causes. You hear a lot of these justifications, and I don't think it's the same, right? And we're going to go into the details as to why. Obviously I think I'm right about what I think, but I do think it's ironic, and I do think it should give me and you pause. And you never want to be in that position where you're rationalizing or justifying or whatever word you want to throw on it, the death of innocent people. And I think that's just something we do have to grapple with. Seeing these images, it just it breaks your heart to see innocent children being bombed and just, you know, suffering in the most horrible ways possible. And I think that we should at first, just grapple with that and just try to relate to a lot of people that, let's just say, that again that aren't really politically aware. And it's just seeing that those images, you'd say, well, this is crazy. How can anybody allow this? And I think those feelings are completely justified. And I think that yeah, it makes sense why people would see that and be outraged by it. But yeah, I guess we
And
can, yeah.
I think a lot of people are also falling victim to availability bias. The media has covered, it's been almost a month since October 7th, and the media covered it for a couple of days. And most of that coverage was focused on Israel's response. What's Israel going to do? And a lot of people didn't really go out of their ways to see the violence, the carnage, the brutality that happened in Israel, right? It took almost a macabre person to look through all the images of burned babies, of dead bodies, of decapitated, civilians throughout Israel. And, looking at those images, it's something that once you start looking at those, it's impossible to get out of your mind.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing is the availability bias. A lot of people, the media for some reason is just enamored with constantly giving you photos and images of that are coming out of Gaza. And rightfully so, right? We it's almost like a school shooting situation where you have to report on it because it'd be irresponsible not to. But you're doing a disservice to everybody because you're kind of giving this school shooter a platform, right? But so you're in a bad position either way. But I think the media has a huge responsibility, and our mainstream media has failed us horribly by not reporting on a lot of the images and a lot of the brutality just as much as they are reporting, on the deaths in Gaza. And then yeah, to the point about the deaths in Gaza, it's awful. And Neil Ferguson had a really good article recently on the Free Press, and he wrote about how Israel and really a lot of us are in this position where he made an analogy to chess, where in chess, where I forget the name of the move, but it's essentially a position where if you make a move in chess, you're going to weaken your position, but you have no other option but to make that move, right? Because in chess, either you give up or you make a move, right? You're forced to make a move, right? So maybe think like endgame or something like that, and you have to move a pawn, but if you move that pawn, you're immediately fucked. So that was a good analogy, I thought, because Israel is in that position, and to go back to the collateral damage and a lot of the deaths that we're seeing, it is, it's horrible. It's horrible. That's not something that anybody ever wants to see. Nobody wants to see, mothers screaming in hospitals. Nobody wants to see children being pulled out of rubble. Nobody wants to see civilians fleeing refugee camps or, quote unquote refugee camps. Um, we can get into that later, a
Yeah.
little bit tongue in cheek, but um, yeah, nobody wants to see these civilians fleeing for their lives. That's not something that anybody wants to be, and nobody wants to be in this position. And it's awful. It's awful to see this, but this is unfortunately the position that Israel and a lot of us have been forced to be in. Like, what do you do when there's a genocidal organization hell bent on, starting off with the Jews, starting off with eliminating all of the Jews in the area, and from there expanding on this, notion of global jihad and martyrdom. They're not going to stop there. They're not going to stop with Israel. They're coming after all of us. So, okay, what do we do? What do we do when and they hide behind children, they hide behind, they hide in schools, they hide in refugee camps, they hide in hospitals. They know they know that we value life more than they value, their civilians life. They value death more, they value martyrdom. There's a great book on Hezbollah. His name is, I'm going to butcher his name, but it's Thanasis Canambis. He wrote a great book on Hezbollah. It's called The Privilege to Die, but it really just highlights and emphasizes how martyrdom, how ingrained martyrdom is in their society, right? When people die in Palestine, they celebrate their picture. They celebrate the fact that they died as martyrs, right? Even today, the Hezbollah um, launched an offensive on Israel, and they post on their social media they're celebrating these martyrs, the people that died in the offensive. Um, and that's something I think people don't grapple with. They see these pictures and they think, well, wow, Israel's doing all these horrible things, but they don't understand that for Hamas, they're hiding behind civilians, and then they're also eager. A lot of them are eager to die,
Yeah.
and they think that if people die, then they're martyred for the cause. So for them, it's not a lose lose. And I think a lot of us just struggle with that. A lot of us. Barry White had a really good podcast recently, and she was talking to this IDF soldier. Um, but basically, he was just saying, Hamas is Hamas just doesn't care about its civilians, and Israel does. Israel does go through great pains to protect its civilians. But yeah, I mean, we can get more into the
Yeah, I
kind of
mean,
the
I think
realities
that
of war. But
that's a big thing because, first of all, obviously you want to start off with the not all, and not all people in Gaza think this way, not all. It is a significant portion, and nobody knows the actual number. But I mean, there's Christians in Gaza as well, and not just Christians, Muslims. I'm sure they grieve for their family. I'm sure they grieve for their death, their dead children, just as much as we do. But there is a significant strain of radical jihadist Muslims that do believe in martyrdom, right? This concept of I die in the name of my God, in the name of Allah, and I will be rewarded for that. My family is going to be rewarded for that. There's a good that's going to come out of me dying. And again, this is a concept that goes over a lot of people's heads because they can't imagine themselves ever actually believing in something like martyrdom, in something like heaven, in something like paradise, where God is going to reward you for dying in the name of Him. And yeah, I think this is just such a key element to this whole conflict that's happened because the insane part of what is actually happening in Gaza right now. And again, it's so ironic because we're making these quote unquote root causes arguments, but I feel like it just applies here way better than it whenever you hear it on the other side because the root cause of what's happening right now in Gaza has all to do with how Hamas has decided to organize their government and how to organize their society in Gaza. Ever since they came into power by being democratically elected in 2005 or 2006, they've decided to turn their little patch of land into a terrorist hellhole, a terrorist death cult hellhole that builds tunnels underground, that they purposely put all their offices, all their weapons, all of their hideouts, wherever they happen to be located in civilian densely populated areas like hospitals, in the most fucked up places possible. And this is in itself a war crime. When people talk about war crimes, you hear it a lot thrown at Israel. But again, Israel is fighting this war with their hands tied behind their backs because not only are they fighting right Hamas, this terrorist death cult, but they have to do it as best as they can to try to minimize civilian deaths because not only is it wrong obviously, but they know they have the weight of the world, they have the world watching them. And it's just so ironic too, this asymmetry between both sides, right? You have one set of government entity or people that go out of their way to murder innocent people and show it to the world, right? They GoPro'd what they did on October 7th. And this is one thing that I think the IDF and Israel has failed in this social media war. I think as cruel as it is, I think people need to see what Hamas did on that day. You're talking about a level of Charles Manson type of psychopathic murdering spree by the thousands, right? People got murdered, over 1,000 people. I think it was over 80% of them got tortured before they were murdered in front of their family, in front of their kids. I think there's a clear asymmetry, and for people that at a certain point, if you there's a lot of political commentators that will willfully just try to deny this vast difference in the morality of these two sides. But I think that once any rational or reasonable person sees it, you can't unsee it. You have one side that goes out of their way to do the most horrible, heinous things. And you have another side that, yes, they're far from perfect. Yes, they may, mess up from time to time. But again, they're not going out of their way to purposely murder and exterminate Palestinian people.
And I
And
think even that goes over a lot of people's heads. So if you're somebody listening and you don't know the timeline or the series of events and the effort that Hamas put into this event, let me just quickly give you a synopsis because I feel like a lot of people don't really know what happened on that day. I think they hear something like, 1800, 1500 Israelis died, but they don't know really what happened. The border of Gaza and Israel is one, there's a huge wall, right? A 20-foot wall. It also goes to some kind of indiscriminate, unknown uh, amount into the ground because Hamas builds tunnels, so it's not widely known how tall or how deep the fence goes, but it's a 20-foot wall that spans the Gaza border, right? And along these borders is pretty much a highly sophisticated Israeli defense system with robots and watchtowers and IDF soldiers stationed at these different locations and fences. Throughout there is also, the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome is famously Israel's defense system against Hamas. On October 7th, here's the effort that Hamas did to murder Israeli civilians. They overwhelmed the Israeli Iron Dome, right? Meaning they sent out thousands of rockets and then a coordinated strike to overwhelm the system. The system couldn't process all of these, you know, essentially low-level rockets that were it was too much for the system to comprehend, and essentially it was overwhelmed, right? After that system was overwhelmed, they then went to the fence and knocked it down, bulldozed the fence, right? They took down the guard towers, they took down the guards, they bulldozed the fence, and once they bulldozed that fence and opened it, bikers, right, the motorcyclists just started streaming through. You're talking about thousands of Hamas fighters. On top of that, there was also paragliders, right? These are the paragliders that the memes that people see, but they don't kind of maybe fully comprehend. Paragliders started going over these fences once the Israeli security systems were down, along with these motorcyclists in a kind of blitzkrieg fashion, right? And they just started pouring into these Israeli towns and settlements along the border, right? Once these Hamas fighters, thousands of Hamas fighters started pouring into these cities, what do you think they did to defenseless Israeli civilians? They butchered them, they beheaded them, they burned them alive. Like Ozzy was saying, 80% were tortured, right? And they didn't stop there because a lot of them, what a lot of people missed was this was a Jewish holiday. So a lot of IDF soldiers were either on vacation or they just weren't on their post. They didn't think on a holiday we're not going to get attacked. And so even then, so they knew that there was essentially just a bunch of defenseless Israeli soldiers or civilians, sorry, just fending for their lives while Hamas just massacred them, right? And I think that the series of events, understanding a little bit about that timeline, kind of helps to kind of paint the picture of the effort that Hamas put into murdering civilians. And when you juxtapose that with Israel is committing genocide to Palestinians, no, they're not. No, Israel never in its history has ever done anything resembling this. Right? They've never ever openly marched in the Gaza city and just started butchering civilians like that.
just the
You've
whole
never
idea.
heard of that.
Yeah.
And that's why when you hear people say things like Israel is committing genocide, that no, they're not. And then cherry on top, what is so October 7th happens, right? One of the worst events, probably the worst event that's ever happened in Israel. October 7th happens. We move a little further down, and then there's all these people, especially on the left, calling for ceasefire, right? They see all these photos. And what does Hamas do? They double down on their efforts. They say, we're not we're not stopping with the ceasefire. We're going to continue the genocide. If we get an opportunity, we're going to do this again. So I think, like we've been saying, a lot of this goes over people's heads. A lot of this, people don't understand the effort that they went through. They kind of maybe, the impression that I get is that they think that there's this perpetual conflict, and that, oh well, Israel does something and then Hamas does something back and then Israel does this. It's not that. This was an unprecedented event, an unprecedented effort to murder Israeli civilians. And I don't know how much more we can emphasize that.
Yeah, it's just so there's a couple things that I want to hit on, but the ceasefire thing right now, that you see a lot of it on social media, people just ceasefire now, and you've seen so many celebrities, sign their little stupid petition of ceasefire, ceasefire. And it's just, again, these people just, they're naive, or they just don't know better, or they're willfully blind. But you're talking about a terrorist organization. Like, it's just so funny. It's ironic, once you see it, you see all these people signing these little petitions, ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. And then you have the head of the government that's part of this conflict saying, shut the fuck up. We want war. We want total war. We want to take over and conquer Israel. We want to destroy Israel. So, so who are these people that are yelling for when they say ceasefire? They're not talking about Hamas. They're talking about Israel. They're talking about Israel. Stop what you're doing. And it's just, again, it's just so hilarious how these people just, they again, it's just this it's just a trend, right? It's just a little hashtag meme that you see now. It's just, oh, ceasefire, ceasefire. Like, what's that gonna do? You're talking again, just like what Jerry just said. These people had just came out on TV a couple of days ago saying, we want war, we want total war. And you don't even have to hear it from them. Their actions speak louder than their words, but they'll gladly tell you they want war. And yeah,
And
that's
just quickly on this point on ceasefire, like, people are, I'm not saying I'm very well educated on military history or combat, but there was a good analogy made for a ceasefire in World War II. Um, Imagine people calling for ceasefire after the invasion of Normandy, right? The whole point of Normandy and for the Allies' invasion of Normandy was to catch the Germans off guard. Now, imagine if you had, and a lot of people in Normandy, a lot of French civilians suffered, but imagine if you had called for a ceasefire right after the invasion of Normandy, right? Would you like, were you going to let Germany just recoup, re-strategize, and kind of, oh well, let me reassess and form a new defensive strategy? Like, that's not the point. The point of these ground assaults and these, air assaults is to weaken their defenses.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a thing that I do want to that we should grapple with. Again, you're talking about a lot of civilians that have died. We don't know the actual number because, again, these are numbers that are coming out of the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, and we know that they lie out their ass. Who can actually trust the real numbers? But you can't deny that a lot of innocent people, quote, have died, right? You're talking about children, you're talking about women in Gaza, and that matters, right? Again, this is the reality of war, and it sucks. It breaks your heart to see. But again, I think that just a lot of people, one, they're not historically literate. When you learn about history, when you learn about war, you read up on just war theory, you read up on the fog of war, you realize that war is horrible, that many innocent people die, the good guys sometimes kill the innocent people, and the bad guys obviously kill the innocent people. But this is just the reality of war. And just a very important statistic that, again, that not a lot of people know, is that in World War II, way more German citizens died, civilians, than British civilians died. And a lot of people right now, they just want to point to, well, look at how many people have died in Gaza versus how many people have died in Israel, as if that tells you really much about the conflict. And it shouldn't, because obviously, if Nazi Germany had more civilians died in World War II, you're not going to automatically assume that they were the the good guys in the conflict. And yeah, again, now you're talking about now, I think, with the age of social media, you're talking about something that I think is just way more harder or complicated for wars, or for a rational state, or the state that we think is in the right, to manage their war. And rightfully so. Obviously, you want to do as much as you can to minimize civilian deaths. But I think that a lot of people, just again, are just very unaware of the trap that Hamas built for their civilians. Like, the people that are ultimately mostly responsible right now for what's happening in Gaza are Hamas. Again, they're the ones that purposely built this trap for their civilians. They purposely push their civilians out into harm's way, do nothing to protect them, right? And we saw this interview as well, where they were asking the Hamas chief, "Well, what are you doing to protect the civilians? You protect yourselves. You built all these tunnels. What are you doing to protect the civilians?" And he's just straight up, "Oh no, that's the UN's job. That's the UN's job to protect the civilians." And again, just this asymmetry of both sides. There's no comparison once you realize. And yeah, I don't know. It's just, again, it
And I
just,
think also the asymmetry when it comes to one of the biggest things that's been surprising about this is the level of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment that's out there. I honestly, I didn't know it was this rampant. And
before
oh,
we
sorry.
get to anti-Semitism, I think let's just end on this really quick, and then we'll jump on anti-Semitism, because this is just something that was on my mind. The people responsible for what's happening right now is Hamas. And I think another quick point that I wanted to make is that just goes so way past people's heads, and nobody's even talking about how not a single Arab country right now is accepting any Palestinian refugees. Not a single. You're talking about, there's what, 20 plus Arab countries in the world, and how many more Muslim countries in the world, and not a single one of them is accepting any refugees. Egypt, which has a border in Gaza, right, that is doing the blockade, is not allowing any type of refugees to come into their country. I think the most amount of pressure right now should be on Egypt to allow women and children to escape Gaza, because they're the ones they're the most closely related to them, and there's no amount of pressure right now. People need to get the hell out of Gaza. People need to realize the whole world should come together and be like, yes, Hamas needs to go. We cannot allow a ISIS like terrorist entity to exist and govern these people like this, and just create more and more chaos, and create more and more. This is what a sane world would do right now. A sane world would be like, yes, all our firepower should go into destroying Hamas, and the innocent civilians that are caught in the conflict. The people that should bear that brunt are the Arab world. The Arab world should be allowing with open arms their refugees, their brothers and sisters, and you're not seeing any of that. And again, it's insane to me how just so many people make excuses for the worst type of of entities. And yeah, it just boggles the mind. I don't know what you're gonna say.
But Yeah, no, I think the asymmetry and what you were alluding to was for me two sides of the same coin was the anti-Semitism because to get back on the point of Egypt not taking any fault, right? A lot of people maybe don't realize, but Gaza shares a border with Egypt, and that border is closed, right? The only border crossing that Gazans are privy to or have access to is Israel. And where do you think Gazans go when they want medical attention? Where do you think they go into Israel? They cross into Israel, and Israel grants them that access. Israel grants work visas to a lot of Palestinians, and a lot of Palestinians go into Israel to work. I don't know what kind of genocidal occupational regime this is letting Palestinians go into its country and work. That I don't know. That doesn't seem like a fascist regime to me. But anyway, and that's not to say again, it's not to say that Israel doesn't have its faults. Obviously it does, and obviously it does a lot of horrible things. But anyway, the point that I was trying to make is you don't see a lot of the same anger and outrage at other countries that mistreat Muslims. And we've been talking about this for years. We were huge advocates of trying to draw attention to what was happening in Syria and the genocide, the true genocide that was happening in Syria. And
Yeah.
nobody gave a fuck.
I think this is
Nobody,
a
there
big
was
thing
no
for me
outrage.
and you that me and you take personal because me and you, especially in what 2014, 2015, we've been following this issue like close to our hearts. It's one of the biggest issues. It was one of the biggest issues. 2015, seeing the chemical weapons that Assad used on his own people. And the irony too that just pisses me off so goddamn much is how so many people on the left right now that are yelling and that are just the most fierce advocates for Hamas, you know, these same people were not only silent when Assad was barrel bombing hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians, but they were making cover for him. They were making excuses for him and labeling the other side as Al Qaeda or labeling innocent civilians being barrel bombed to death as Al Qaeda. And these same people are now on the side of freedom, on the side of democracy, on the side of like shut the fuck up. The
Ceasefire.
whole yeah, ceasefire. The whole it's just again, and when you talk about proportionality, when you talk about, our heart breaks for we don't know the number. They say it's 8,000, 7,000. I don't know how many women and children have died and innocent civilians have died in Gaza. Your heart breaks for them. But in Syria, you're talking about 500,000 dead, at least 500,000. In Yemen, you're talking about, you're right. These are Arab countries. In Yemen, there's a civil war because the Houthis, which are backed by Iran, and the Saudis are fighting, right? I don't know how many people have died. I don't know the exact number, but again, you're probably talking about hundreds of thousands of 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 innocent people dying. And the only one that really starts to make news is when, if it's not Jews, it's not on the news. And
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 yeah,
yeah,
where's the outrage
to
where
the anti-Semitism.
and where's the outrage when China has been putting Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, right? And there's
Yeah,
countless
where's the
examples like
protest?
this. Yeah,
Where's
where's
the
the protest?
protest where you see 50,000 people in London, 50,000. And another a key thing about all these protests that you're seeing now, you're seeing a bait and switch because right now a lot of people that are protesting, they feel like, oh, well, they're people see the protests and they're like, oh, they're protesting all the bombing that's going on. They're protesting, and it's like, no, let's get one thing correct. Let's make clear of one thing, very clear thing. These protests started happening the day after, or probably the same day, October 7th, that the massacre happened. The day after, you saw viral video after viral video, people yelling into microphones about how happy they were that all these innocent Jewish people were fucking murdered to death. And you just saw countless streams of these videos. And they weren't protesting Israel's response. They were promote, they were happy
Celebrating.
to
Yeah.
celebrate. Yeah, exactly. They were celebrating it. And it's just, it should be just a massive wake-up call to anybody that is is from the West, or is that, or that yeah, that lives in the West, and it's just, you're seeing just so much bigotry and hatred and outright endorsement and celebration of the most horrible possible things from thousands and thousands of people, right? You don't want to generalize the Islamic world. You don't want to generalize any set of humans, period. As best as you can, as a rational human, you have to, as best as you can, treat people as individuals. But this doesn't mean that you can't just follow patterns. You can't just, stereotypes exist for a reason, right? And you can make your hedges and say not all, hashtag not all. And we're not talking about all, but a very real, scary, significant, if not majority portion of the Islamic Muslim world right now is telling you who they are. And so many people are just either closing their eyes because they don't want to see and they don't want to admit to themselves of what these people are saying. But yeah, it's just a scary time because a lot of people are just like in your face about who they are, and I think it is what it is, but yeah, it's just a scary times are ahead, because in the West, again, we've allowed so many of these people in through our own goodwill. And what do you do now? What do you do? I don't know what you do. You can't just, I don't know if you can just deport all these people, but I do think that there's a very real conversation now that we need to have about what it means for free speech, what it, all these rights that we value for a reason. But I think all these values, like free speech, are being taken advantage of by people that don't believe in free speech, by people that don't believe in the same values that we do. And they're being used against us. And I don't think any society that holds these values dear, that preaches these values, it can't survive, right? It can't survive if these same values are going to be our death, our destruction. And so and
But I
so
think
yeah.
that that was kind of inherent to something like the civil rights movement, where the civil rights movement is intrinsically or inherently anti-free speech. It impinges on your right to say what you feel, say what you think, or act a certain way, right? If somebody wants to get a job and they're black, the person hiring can't make a decision or an assessment based on their race, their age, their religion. So it's almost like you're impeding on somebody's, and it makes sense at the time. It made sense, right? Because the nation, for especially the South, was predominantly very racist area, and they had separation. They had separate schools, but equal treatment. They had separate facilities for black people. So I think with a situation like this, with anti-Semitism or open terrorist support, I think you kind of almost need a civil rights movement where it does impede on your freedom of speech. But I think many people consensibly agree that we can't tolerate anti-Semitism to this degree. We can't tolerate
But
the
it's
open
not,
support for
I think,
terrorism.
yeah, I think it's not so much anti-Semitism. Obviously, I think that it's horrible and that we should condemn it. But I think more than anti-Semitism, I think once you start outright supporting, celebrating terrorist organizations, I think us as a free society have every right to raise our eyebrows and either, right, this just, you just breach a contract of humanity, that you're pretty much admitting that no, it's open season. And at that point, I think just any sane individual or any sane society, I think you have the you would be crazy not to either deport this person or do something about it, because again, they're telling you who they are. They're endorsing murder. They're endorsing innocent people And how do you know you're not next? And how do you know they won't be part of that attack? And so yeah, it's just, again, I don't know. I think that
But
in
I
the
think also a
coming
lot of the free speech, like, and I am to an extent, I guess, a free speech advocate and not an absolutist. I think there's limits to what you can say, and obviously there's gray areas. But I think a lot of the so quote unquote free speech absolutists, you've kind of painted yourself into a corner. What do you do when there's open support for the destruction of your society? Like, what do you support that? What do you stand by and stand on your morals and your
your
views and just
own-
wait for your society to be destroyed? Like, there's obviously limits to freedom of speech. Obviously, we should all be free to say whatever we think. Obviously, we should be able to report on the things that we want to report on, and government, the basics are there, and it's a good, framework. It's a good, you building block for a society. But there's limits, and there's people that obviously take advantage of it, and there's people that want to destroy society, that don't value your values. They value different things. And if we don't have that contractual agreement, then I'm sorry, but you're not welcomed in this society, and yeah, it's a hard problem because you do have to impede on people's rights. You do have to kind of be a little bit more authoritarian, and maybe that is the way that to go.
yeah,
Maybe the future doesn't bend towards liberalism. Maybe the future does bend towards something like what China's doing,
yeah.
more of an authoritarian society. Um, because that, for all its faults, China is not, it doesn't maybe have the same societal pitfalls that we're experiencing. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying I'm advocating for a society like China, but it
I
does
think there's
have
a
those
there's a
built-in safeguards.
there's a happy medium to be found. But I think that ultimately in this reality that we live in, all that really matters is power, right? It's either rule or be ruled. And you see this in the animal kingdom. You see that reality, that harsh reality, that the animal world is cruel. And ultimately how good you are at defending your own survival is all that really matters, and how good you are at attacking and surviving is all that really matters. And I think that same reality is what we're faced with, as much as we don't want it to be, as much as we want to just be normal people to live our own lives, right? History is just coming into to play. And I think a lot of people just turned away. But that should have woken us up after 9/11, right? There's people out there that hate our guts, and it's not because of something we did, or even if it is, right? They still hate your guts. They still want to destroy you. And what, you're gonna allow yourself to be destroyed? What, again, it's either rule or be ruled. And China hates our guts. They want to take over. Russia hates our guts. They want to take over. Islamists, jihadists, they hate our guts. They want to destroy America through the inside and through the outside by any means necessary. And again,
And I
as
think this is like a point that goes over a lot of people's heads as well. And a lot of people don't understand it. As soon as one of these kind of like authoritarian, power hungry, power, dominant crazed nations or ideologies, as soon as they find a loophole, they'll take advantage of your loophole. Look at what the United Nations has become. The United
yeah,
Nations has just become a festering, terrible place where these despots and authoritarians just go cry foul, and the only people that care are the U.S. and France and Britain, and everybody else. Like, I'm not going to listen to the UN. Like, and it just becomes these like cesspools. And I feel like a lot of the West's enemies have found loopholes.
yeah,
They've taken advantage of things like, you know immigration policies or free speech policies, or our sympathies for the treatment of minorities, right? And they take advantage of that. China is now taking advantage with things like TikTok, right? They pour massive amounts of resources and effort to try to sway political opinion and public opinion in the US. And we have this huge problem in the US where a lot of these kids, 15 to 25, I think I read like 50, 60% think that Hamas was justified in their actions.
Yeah.
And it's because they're all obsessed with TikTok. And it's because China is anti Israel. And China has found that loophole. China has found that loophole with social media, and they're going to keep badgering. They're going to keep attacking. And
Yeah.
these nations, like you said, it's rule or be ruled. And sure, we can kind of do a Teddy Roosevelt. I forget the quote, speak softly and carry a big stick or something like that, where yeah, you can be kind and compassionate and rule and have the society that you want to build. And we have, the West has built beautiful societies and things that we should all be proud of, open and multicultural societies that welcome
But that's
outsiders.
that's the
But
that's the key point right there. That's the key point that goes over so many people's heads, and what me and you have been screaming about for so many years now is how people don't realize that the Western societies are the most tolerant, are the most culturally, by any means, tolerant societies in the world. Comparatively speaking, they're the best ones. When you look at any, it's not saying we're perfect. It's not saying that we have it all figured it out, but again, it's just like this is comes down to information warfare, and it comes down to what China has been trying to do within our societies is sow these seeds of, oh no, the real problem in the world is America. The real problem in the world is the United States or the Western world. The real problem is how they treat their minorities. The real problem is what they do abroad, what they did in Iraq. And again, it's just couldn't be further from the truth. When you look at things like the Iraq War, for all of its faults, for all of its flaws, for all of its short-sightedness, we and it's just so funny too now hearing all these progressives speak about it like, oh, we invaded the country, we killed hundreds of thousands of people, and they just use these words, these phrases that just don't really have any meaning, and they don't have any relation to reality. You could disagree with Iraq, you could disagree with what we did in Afghanistan, but we went into these societies to try and liberate them from dictatorships, from oppressive regimes that were doing genuine horror and harm to their people, right? Saddam Hussein was one of the worst dictators of the 20th century, of the late 20th century, of the 21st century. And the Taliban we didn't go into Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban, but we had to after we knew that they were holding to Osama bin Laden, and try to help these societies for all the imperfect things that we did. Abu Ghraib, what's the place, the jail in Cuba? Again,
oh, Guantanamo.
yeah, Guantanamo Bay. Again, we're not perfect, and we should do just like Israel's not perfect, but our uniqueness and our good comes from the realization that we're not, and comes from this self-reflecting polity and body that we have, where we have the actual ability to self-examine. And ironically, this ability to self-examine is what's causing our downfall, because when you do this too much, this, oh, I may be wrong, and this is something that exists was within me too. I'm somebody that's always trying to re-examine his beliefs. I'm always somebody that, as much as I have strongly held beliefs, I always try to figure out, maybe I'm wrong about this, but this self-critical aspect of the human psyche, it's something that exists in America uniquely. It's something that exists. You don't see China speaking like this. You don't see Russia talk. You don't see the Arab worlds talking like this. And again, it's ironic that our ability to be self-critical is what ultimately might be the cause of our downfall, because you can take that to an extreme, and if you do, then you're not really holding on, you're not really standing for your values anymore, and there is some that we should change that we hold strong here in America for a reason, like we are talking about free speech, like freedom of religion, like the way we've treated minorities. Again, far from perfect, but we've
And it's
made
a,
progress, and
I
that
think for a lot
progress.
of, I think for a lot of leftists, it's also a failure to realize or maybe acknowledge, like, I don't know, I have a hard time finding the words for it. It's like a failure to realize how good you have it,
Yeah,
basically. You see a lot of people on the left going, LGBTQ for Palestine or LGBTQ for Hamas. Like that's the funniest meme on the planet. Like, do you not realize how good you have it here? Do you not realize what would
it's
happen in
hilarious
other
because
societies? Like,
immediately when you bring that up, they're like, oh well, we have it here, gays have it bad here too, they have it here bad here too in America. And again, it's just this desperate attempt to try to make an equivalence between a society that hate people to death versus a society that has somewhat far right extremist Christians that believe in gay conversion therapy. Like, what's the worst thing a Christian here is going to do? Deny you the right to get married? Okay, yeah, that sucks. Yeah, that's bad. But you're not getting murdered. You're not getting, and it's just, again, this is just so beyond rude. It's just such a desperate attempt to not come to terms with the fact that America, Western societies, European countries, for whatever reason, have had the best societies, not in some supremacist way, but in just an objective reality type of way that
yeah, and
our
quality of life
society
for
has worked
everybody.
better. Yeah, our quality of life are by any objective metric. And again, just ask yourself why you see so many quote unquote minorities sacrifice their lives, risk their lives just to get here in the first place. Just turn on the news and you'll see a river, a stream, a horde of people risking their lives, jumping through rivers, jumping through barbed wire just to get here. Why? Why? If we're the
And
worst.
it's also an ignorance on a lot of people on the left, an ignorance on what a lot of people in war-torn countries experience. Like, in war-torn countries and in places that experience actual conflict, the first nation that they call to is the United States, right? There was in Iraq during Saddam's reign and shortly after the Iraq War started, I think I think it was over 70% of Iraqis supported the US invasion of Iraq. Now, what happened afterward, you can debate, you can talk about, but overwhelmingly there was support among the Iraqi population to remove Saddam Hussein or for the US intervention. And this has been the story of US foreign policy for the last 30, 40 years, right? That when people are in conflict and when people experience despotism or genocide or whatever it is, the first nation that they call for is the United States. Now,
Yeah.
try to explain that to somebody on the left who thinks that the US is the worst thing to have ever existed and wants to wipe out this country. Like, it's just, I think it's just an ignorance. I think it's just a lack of, I don't know, maybe experiencing the world and leaving the US and maybe going out and interviewing and seeing how other people live. Because I think very quickly, this neoconservative idea has always stuck with me. And for the longest time I had it on my handle was neoconservative. But this idea that neoconservatives are liberals mugged by reality, that that always stuck with me. And it was something that, like, a sentiment that you know I still believe in. And it's true, liberalism does give you a lot of these sentiments, a lot of these, sympathies, and a lot of the ability to kind of look past and sympathize and have compassion for a lot of the stories, especially minorities. But I think you also have to be mugged by reality a little bit. I think you have to experience what other people experience so that you're not so naive in the world, so that you're not so idealistic. And I feel like a lot of the left is very naive. They don't realize that they can't imagine that there's other people that want to kill them. They can't imagine that there's other people that want to destroy their way of life. They just think the U.S. is the worst thing ever, and that's it. We have to fight this. American
I think
power.
if nothing else, the last 3 years that Biden's been in office have, to me, they've just proven correct neoconservatism. Not this idea that we should go invade, every country and just depose dictators left and right, but just the basic premise of American hegemony, of American supremacy, of the power of America to provide actual good in the world, right? These three major disasters that have under Biden cement that fact. Afghanistan, what happened right when we pulled out? Boom, the Taliban take over. And what was Biden saying days before, months before? No, everything's gonna be fine. Oh, the Afghan government, no. And again, we weren't even sacrificing any type of American life. We had less than 1,000 or something American troops holding this country somewhat together. And what happened the moment we pulled out? Taliban take over. Now no women's allowed to go to school. Sharia law, the most horrible refugee crisis. A bunch of people that had helped us during the Afghanistan war, we left them to the Taliban to get murdered. And then again, you saw that with Russia invading Ukraine. And again, you saw this need for American hegemony, this need for American power, this need for, okay, if nobody else is the king on the chessboard, or if nobody else is the head honcho in this world, who's it gonna be? Russia? Okay, look what they did in Ukraine, invading a sovereign country for what? For nothing. Look at China. Look at and again, and this is, to me, again, it talks to what we were talking about, the America and the need to appreciate the need for us to make it a better society. And yeah, when you talk about all these things too, even when you talk about things like the Vietnam War, you can make the argument that sure, America had nothing to do with what happened in Vietnam, and we're probably better off not even involving ourselves. But then you look at the history, and you look at, okay, well, Vietnam, the people that were trying to take over were backed by the Soviet Union, were backed by communists. And again, there's so many people now, not to get into this whole communism capitalism debate, but if you just history, you realize that 99, if not 100% of the communist countries turned out to be shitholes, and a great majority of the capitalist countries that were backed by America turned out way, way better. Not perfect, but at least they weren't totalitarian shitholes that the communist Soviet Union was backing. And so at things like Vietnam, the Soviet Union had a hand in. So it was either the Soviet Union takes over, right? Communism spreads in Vietnam, and these people are put into a worse outcome because we know how communist countries end up, or America takes over as well. And it's this idea of be ruled, or conquer, or be conquered. Again, it's just the reality of the world that we live in. And if it's not going to be us, then who's it going to be? And that's all I ask people that aren't very, they don't really think this type of way, or haven't really thought this type of way. But just ask yourself, who would you prefer? Where would you prefer to live? Why do you still consistently choose to live here? Do you want to go move to Russia? Do you want to go move to the Soviet Union? If you could travel back in time, would you prefer to live in West Germany or East Germany? If you know anything about the Berlin Wall, if you know anything about the history of what happened in those two different experiments, the choice is clear. And you saw that in North Korea and South Korea, and now you're seeing it now in the rest of the world. And yeah, I think it's just all coming into a head right now. And I think the next 5, 10 years, I mean, if we could leave it at something, is just gonna make what we're talking about. Maybe we're wrong, but I think the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's just gonna, a lot of people are gonna just be mugged by reality, like you were saying, because it's just not gonna go away. Terrorism, jihadism is gonna stay for the rest of our lives, we're going to see more and more terrorist attacks, especially now that a lot of people are pissed off because of what Israel, quote unquote, did, or the America's backing of Israel. And now they have all this, the Arab world pissed off, right? Not rightfully so, not, but again, this is going to stay, and Russia's going to only be emboldened. We have a new axis of evil, China as well, and they're going to try to invade Taiwan, and Russia's, again, these bad actors are not going to go away, right? It's just no matter what you try to do, no matter how you try to just no, they keep pulling you back in. It's like the mafia, and I don't know that quote of they just keep pulling me back in. That's just, I think, a lot of people, no matter what, where you stand politically, no matter where, especially for the politically neutral people, because I think a lot of people, no matter what happens, unless China and Russia invaded tomorrow, I think most people that are on the left, or most people that are willingly blind about these things, they're never going to wake up, because we just go back to our priors whenever something happens, and days after, just go back to our priors. But I think for most people that aren't really politically aware, politically neutral, the more these things happen, the more these jihadist attacks happen, the more Russia, Putin does belligerent things like invade countries, the more China probably gonna invade Taiwan. I think that, again, people are, and the see so many people flocking to these European and Western countries. I think people are just going to realize that, well, yeah, it's either going to be us or them. So pick your sides now. It's time to pick your back. Pick. Who are you going to pick? Are the LGBT people going to still be on the side of the jihadists when they come into the land and they start to
or
conquer?
even
I don't
China.
think so. Yeah, China, Russia. Russia, you think they have gay rights in Russia? You think they have gay rights in, it's just, again, it's ridiculous. And if nothing else, you're just seeing the so many people being proved wrong about what American society is. This racist hellhole that, just wants to oppress people. Again, we're far from perfect. The police is far from perfect. But again, if you're a minority, if you're just any random person in the world, where would you choose to live right now? Any European country, or any country, or any state in the US? Way better than what you're going to live in the dictatorship of Egypt, any Arab country. There's no democratic country in the Arab population. What Arab what Arabs, you saw this in the Arab Spring as
I
well.
mean,
They tried
the only one is Israel, but apparently the left is just hell bent on hating them,
yeah,
and that's where the irony is. But I think what you're saying, it's true, but I think it's almost a double edged sword, because if what you're saying, which I think it is, what you're saying is true, but I think what a lot of people, the consequences of that is that you kind of have to toughen up a bit, and you can't be so soft, especially when it comes to immigration.
yeah,
And while it sucks, especially what we saw, the genocide in Syria, it was terrible, it was awful, but look at
yeah,
the consequences now of Europe taking in all of those migrants.
yeah.
And
And
that
it's
just, I
so
think,
ironic too, as well, because you have this term that's so evil to so many people, called regime change. And people like us, we advocated for regime change and deposing of a genocidal, literal genocidal. When you have this word being thrown around calling Israel genocidal, you're talking about a dictator that murdered 500,000 people. I think you can call that genocidal. And we advocate opposing him. And especially early in the Arab Spring, you had a lot of Syrian people that genuinely believed in democracy, that simply wanted to have a democratic government in their society. And yeah, eventually it got taken over by a lot of bad people like Al Qaeda, like ISIS. And that's one of the scary things of the Arab world, where, a lot of democratic societies, a lot of people that, believe in things that we do, sadly get overtaken by the radicals, sadly get overtaken because they're more violent, because they're more willing to kill or be killed in the name of their cause. Whereas it's the people that simply want to have a democratic state. But yeah, ironically, we were some people that, okay, no matter what you can't allow for a genocidal dictator to continue to do what he did. And look what he did. He murdered so many people. But again, in these situations, I think ideally the fellow Arab countries should have been the ones that took in the refugees, but you never see that
Yeah,
type
and
of.
it's almost a situation of like you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say I'm not for regime change, but then look what happens when you don't intervene in something like Syria, which is genocide.
Yeah,
And you
yeah,
can't,
exactly.
it's just, I don't know. I think it's a naive worldview, I think. But yeah,
It's for another day.
but yeah,
Yeah, regime change, neoconservatism.
yeah.
But yeah,
But
I don't know.
yeah, no, I guess ultimately the last thing I guess was, yeah, I think people need to toughen up. I think the politically neutral, it's fine if you're politically neutral, but I think a lot of people are just reacting to what they see and not really maybe educating themselves on the history of it or the history of this conflict, and they just react to photos or videos and then they think they have it all figured out and that Israel's the
Yeah,
bad guy. And I think it's going to continue to happen. I think people are just inherently not interested in a lot of geopolitics and maybe only react to the big news. But that's really the wrong the wrong impression or the wrong thing to do here,
yeah,
especially with this conflict that's so complicated. But yeah, I don't think you can draw any kind of moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. And
yeah. It's insane.
yeah, yeah, the pictures are obviously horrible, but yeah, I don't know, maybe get a little more educated before you make any more Instagram posts.
Yeah. Well, scary
Well, yeah,
time.
yeah, cool.
But
Well, yeah, we'll try to do this again next or 2 weeks from now, but
sure.
next week I'm gonna be traveling. But yeah, let's do it again.
All right, brother.
All right, man.
Good.
Yeah.
See ya.